you so much, everyone, for staying with us. Earlier, we told you about the meeting of the Chief of Army Staff when he visited President Bola Tinubu earlier today. Let me remind you that he has said that he is committed to securing the nation with the help of the president. And he said that he's going to ensure that he approach things in a different but dynamic ways. And he's also briefed the president on the manner in which to go in ensuring that under his watch as the Chief of Army Staff, things of security situation are being handled. Let's get some perspectives on the security situation in the country and perhaps some of the issues that have cropped up in the past. I'm being joined by the Executive Director of Beacon Security and Security Consultant, Dr. Kabiru Adamu, who is virtually with us on the program. Thank you so much, Dr. Adamu, for joining us tonight.
My pleasure, Sheung. Good evening.
I appreciate it. Now, if you hear what the Chief of Army Staff said, meeting with the President, I imagine that was his very first meeting with President Tinubu since he assumed office. And I can imagine that I assume that it's a courtesy call to say, yes, sir, I've resumed duty, and what would you have me do? But from what he said, what do you make of the new man at the helm of affairs controlling the nation's army?
Well, it's to wish him well and to also remind him of the responsibility that is ahead of him. He took over from a man who was a soldier in and out and demonstrated that in his leadership abilities. He was at the forefront. And I think a lot of Nigerians would bear witness to that. Now, having said that, in some of the statements he has made, initially, immediately after his appointment, he did indicate that he will carry on with the legacy of the immediate past Chief of Army Staff. And the legacies were around three things: welfare of the soldiers, interoperability, in other words, working together with the other arms of the military, the Air Force and the Navy, and of course with the Chief of Defense Staff, and then with the other security agencies. And then, of course, the third point is equipment repository of the Army. Today, after the meeting with the President, he hinted at two things. He talked about inclusive leadership and talked about innovations. Now, whether you look at these two or the first three, which is a carry-on from the immediate past Chief of Army Staff, they are commendable notions. And they are things that anyone who wishes well for not just the Army, but for the defense sector and the country as a whole would be happy hearing from the Chief of Army Staff. There are a couple of other things that I'm hoping as he progresses he would look at. Number one is to remind himself that he is just one out of at least about 29 or 28 other security departments in the country, and that he needs to work with them to achieve the operational mandate of not just the Army, but the defense sector. Number two is the institutional problems that are facing the Army. Issues around discipline, issues around promotion, issues around welfare, name them. He would need to look closely at those things to allow the Army to achieve its mandate. And then, of course, some of the burgeoning challenges that are affecting Nigeria in terms of security issues, which hopefully we're going to talk about shortly. He needs to realize that the responsibility is one that is on him, and it's a responsibility that cuts across the entire security sector. Like I said, there are about 29 MDAs that are responsible for addressing those securities, and embedded in those NDAs, there are coordinating elements, and then there are operational elements. So that realization would help him go a long way.
I want to imagine that with a very, very imposing security problems that Nigeria has in terms of internal and external security pressure and threats, the towering physical figure of the Chief of Army Staff might also scare the threats away, and perhaps some of his experience might come to bear. He was a teacher. The man manned one of the largest infantry or corps of the Nigerian military. The man was also perhaps a classmate to the late Chief of Army Staff. Also, this man had served in ECOMOG in Liberia, ECOMOG mission in Liberia. So it's come with some profile that is respectable. But the big question here right now is the reports that your office have released about the security situation and the threats in the country. We're talking at a moment where we have the security, an emerging security threat in the northwestern region of the country, Sokoto, Kebbi, some part of Katsina. We're seeing some issues in Zamfara. We saw what Kaduna State Governor has done in terms of the carrot approach. Give us an idea of what the military can do immediately. He says he wants to look at things a bit more differently.
Well, like he indicated innovations, and innovations would mean technology. And yes, technology, it can be a force multiplier for the military. It can help boost intelligence. It can help boost the performance of the military. But here, what is even more important is getting the buy-in of the people. And I'm quite delighted with the narrative that I've been hearing from the Chief of Defense Staff, where he has repeatedly reminded, especially the political class, of the relevance of balancing the kinetic with the non-kinetic approach to addressing the security challenges. Like we've indicated in our report, what is even more important than beyond anything is the understanding that the drivers and the triggers of insecurity are rooted in these non-kinetic elements, the socio-economic circumstances in the country, the porosity of our borders, the environmental issues that are driving insecurity, political issues, local and, of course, international, especially if you look at circumstances around the Sahel at the moment. So understanding all of these things, and then, of course, working together with the other elements within the security sector. I talked about the porosity of our borders. It's not the army that would manage that. No matter how good the army is, if weapons and combatants continue crossing into the country through those porous borders, there is really nothing that the army can do. So that understanding, and then, of course, promoting through the coordinating elements within the security sector, synergy, collaboration, coordination, cooperation among all these units within the sector would be the way to go. I mean, all the attributes you've mentioned, they are amazing. We have to give him that. But no matter how good he is, if he does not promote this interoperability, unfortunately, it will be very difficult for him to succeed. So I like the fact that he has highlighted the interoperability, which is also what the Chief of Defense Staff is highlighting. So the rest is to see how that will be implemented. And again, the most important thing is to get the buy-in of Nigerians, and it is only through these non-kinetic measures that I've mentioned. Unfortunately, it's not the responsibility of the military to get this buy-in. It is more the responsibility of the political class. We have a policy in place. They call it the policy framework on countering violent extremism, which is embedded inside the Office of the National Security Advisor. There are different elements within the government and within the society that have responsibility for implementing this PCVE, policy framework on countering violent extremism. Yes, the army has a role too, but the role of the army is quite insignificant. In fact, the entire military setup have only about 20% of that role. The rest of the 80% is with the civilian component, the political class, you and I, especially the media as an example. So this is what I'm hoping going forward, that we would see not just from him, the Chief of Army Staff, but from the other key players, the stakeholders within the security and defense sector.
There is an intel that Beacon Security released in its report. And I'm particularly looking at the page 11 of the report, a comparative analysis of the incident and the threat in the month of October compared to the month of November. It does look like things are looking up and looking well in terms of some of the incidents and the trends. It shows that there are decline in the threats and decline also in incidents and a decline also in fatalities, which is somewhat a good news, meaning that lesser people died, lesser people were abducted, lesser people are affected by insecurity situation in the country. But there was a rider, there was a note that you put in the page 11, and it says that you said that there is a fluctuating nature in the trend of security threat analyses in the country. But what can you say specifically? We are going into the month of December. There are a lot of activities across the country, and people are usually exposed to security threats. Give us an understanding of these figures: reduction in abduction, reduction in incident, reduction in fatalities. This cannot be fluke. This cannot be a guesswork. It must be that the security agencies are doing something.
No, definitely. We've seen an increase in security operations, and we highlighted it in our report. In particular, Operation Fansanyama, which just started in the Northwest. We've seen an intensity of, interdiction operations by the military. In several other parts of the country, we're seeing those type of operations, and it's not just by the military, by the other security agencies. So yes, this type of successes are being recorded. In the three metrics that we've presented in the graph you just showed, there were reductions. In the case of abduction, a reduction of about 19%. And then in the case of fatalities, a reduction of about 38.45%. But Shehu, what is worrisome is because we do this regularly on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, we do an aggregate for a period. So as an example, from January to this month of, let's say last month, 11th, we know that more than 12,000 persons have been killed as a result of this. So it's a little bit difficult for me to clap my hands when I know with that global, realization that about 12,000 people have been killed. But the missing elements are two words: sustainability and resilience. Whatever measure we introduce, it has to be sustainable and it has to be resilient. We have to arm our communities with the capacity to be resilient. And that is why earlier on I spoke about buy-in. The measures that we're introducing, that the military is doing, commendable. And we've mentioned it severally in the report, but we have to move forward to make those measures sustainable so that the ownership of those measures is by the communities. And we now have a resilient community that can resist the dastardly and dangerous violent attacks by these threat elements. That is when we wake up and clap our hands and say, we brought this to an end. And I think that is where this administration is headed. Hopefully, if they take the advice that people like us and several others are giving in terms of increasing the non-kinetic component, let the political class take ownership of those non-kinetic elements, introduce them within the society so that we see a reduction. I'll be happy one day if I look at these figures and then I see only 100 people being killed in a month. And then, of course, it goes down to 10. Then I'll be happy.
So quickly, before I get you into, you do an analysis of the FCT of Lagos and some of the security threats. About all the ones you did in the Northwest shows that there is a major problem is the issue of abduction. There's still the issue of abduction in the Northwest region of the country. The new threat, the cell that is threatening Sokoto, Kebbi, and that region of the country is still also there, and the military says they are clamping down on them. But let me ask you, and this is pointed actually, would you say in the last year or so that Nigeria is more secured than this government met it?
Shehu, with all sense of responsibility and using data and nothing more than data, unfortunately, no. Like I mentioned earlier on, 12,000 Nigerians had been killed as at the month of November. Last year, the total figure was less than 10,000 for the entire year. So, unfortunately, using data alone, the figure tells us that the situation is not better. However, like I mentioned earlier on, there is a lot that is ongoing from our security forces. They are doing a lot, but it has to be taken a step forward. Let the ownership, the buy-in go to the communities, and then maybe we would see a reduction, the type that we want.
Now, I'm going to wrap up on these, and a very brief one. The issue of the new cell in Sokoto, Kebbi, and threatening and taking over some communities, which the military said they are chasing them out. How best do you think we can handle it? How much of a threat do you think that is?
We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have 3 amazing policy documents. The National Counterterrorism Strategy. Again, the word is national. The second document, I spoke to it earlier on, which is the policy framework on countering violent extremism. And then the third one is the Act, which is the Terrorism Prohibition and Prevention Act, as amended 2022. Now, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to go and implement those policies the way they are. Unfortunately, and again, with all sense of responsibility, we concentrated in the Northeast a little bit too much, without seeing what was happening in the Sahel. If we had taken note of developments in the Sahel, we would have implemented even more of what we're implementing in the Northeast, in the Northwest. Now, what is happening at the moment is that groups that are operating in the Sahel, that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda and that are affiliated with Islamic State, they form some form of collaboration with groups that are operating in the Northwest. This is not rocket science. Anyone who has been monitoring development would have known that the radicalization of those groups was just a matter of time. And now that we've left that to happen, we should go back and implement the recommendations. Now, there are 4 components in all of these 3 documents that I mentioned. The need to forestall, the need to identify, the need to prevent, and then, of course, the need to implement. Now, the moment we do that, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I must say the National Assembly has a role to play in this regard. The oversight function that they play to ensure the executive arm implements this thing, to support in terms of budgeting, we need to see an improvement in that. So that whole of government approach that we talk about, we need to see it. In 2025, I'm hoping to see a whole of government and a whole of society approach to ending insecurity in Nigeria.
Dr. Kabir Adamu, thank you so much for the insight and the work that you and your colleague have done on that report. Thank you so much indeed for your time tonight.
Thank you for having me.